The billionaire's son began to panic because the next line of the will was never supposed to be read out loud. No one in that Chicago church expected the quiet, homeless boy sitting near the back to stand up that day. The funeral of billionaire Margaret Whitmore was supposed to follow a simple tradition: family, lawyers, and a reading of the will. But before she died, the billionaire left one strange final request. She wanted the will to be read, not by her lawyer and not by her powerful son, but by a homeless boy named Marcus Reed. And the moment Marcus opened the envelope and began to read, the entire room fell silent. The morning sky over Chicago was the color of wet concrete. A cold wind moved slowly through the streets, carrying the faint smell of rain and the distant sound of traffic along Lakeshore Drive. Outside St. Andrew Church, a line of black luxury cars stretched along the curb like silent shadows. Drivers in dark suits stood beside polished doors, waiting. Inside the church, the air was warm but heavy with quiet. Rows of polished wooden pews were filled with people who looked like they belonged on magazine covers: CEOs, investors, politicians, and members of Chicago's most powerful families. Expensive coats hung neatly over their arms. Soft murmurs floated through the room like whispers behind glass. They had all come for the same reason. Margaret Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Technologies, one of the wealthiest women in America, a billionaire whose name had once appeared on every major business channel in the country. Now her photograph rested beside a white casket at the front of the church. In the picture, Margaret Whitmore was smiling gently, her silver hair brushed neatly over her shoulders. The image felt strangely warm against the gray stillness of the room. Near the front row sat her family. Richard Whitmore, her only son, leaned back in the pew with a stiff expression. His suit was perfectly tailored, his posture rigid. To anyone watching, he looked like a man holding the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Around him sat cousins, distant relatives, and business partners, people who had spent years orbiting Margaret's wealth. They spoke quietly among themselves. Most of them were already thinking about what came next: the inheritance. The church doors creaked softly as they opened again. A few heads turned, expecting another executive or investor. Instead, a young man stepped inside. His shoes were worn. His coat was thin and slightly too large for him, as if it had belonged to someone else once. His hair was short, his posture cautious, like someone used to standing where he didn't quite belong. Marcus Reed paused just inside the doorway. For a moment, he simply looked around. The chandeliers glowed softly above him. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shapes across the floor. He had never been inside a church this beautiful before. A few people glanced at him and quickly looked away. Others didn't bother hiding their confusion. Marcus quietly moved toward the back row and sat down. He folded his hands together, trying to make himself smaller. To most of the room, he looked completely out of place, which in truth he was. A whisper passed through the pews. "Who is that? Did someone invite him? Is he from the kitchen staff?" Marcus kept his eyes down. He had heard whispers like that before. Many times. At the front of the church, the funeral director stepped aside as a tall man in a dark suit approached the podium. Daniel Brooks, Margaret Whitmore's personal attorney for nearly 20 years. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his calm voice carried easily through the quiet room. "Thank you all for coming today to honor the life of Margaret Whitmore." The murmurs faded. Brooks spoke slowly, respectfully, describing Margaret's achievements, her company, her philanthropy, the scholarships she had funded across the country. People nodded politely. Some listened. Others simply waited. Because everyone in the room knew something else was coming. Eventually, Brooks closed the folder in front of him and looked out across the church. "There is one final request Mrs. Whitmore made before her passing," he said. That sentence alone shifted the air in the room. Richard Whitmore straightened slightly. Brooks continued. She asked that a specific person be present today, and that this person read a portion of her final letter. A few guests exchanged puzzled looks. Brooks adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. Then he spoke a name. Marcus Reed. The words seemed to echo through the church. For a moment, nothing happened. Then heads began to turn. Row after row of people slowly looked toward the back of the room. Marcus froze. He felt every pair of eyes landing on him at once. Richard Whitmore turned around sharply. His gaze landed on Marcus and narrowed instantly. Brooks gave a small, patient nod toward the aisle. Mr. Reed, would you please come forward? Marcus stood slowly. His hands felt colder than the Chicago wind outside. He walked down the long center aisle between rows of polished pews. The quiet in the church grew deeper with every step. Some guests stared openly, others whispered behind their hands. A billionaire's funeral, and a homeless young man walking toward the podium. Marcus could feel the tension pressing against his chest. He had never imagined being here. Not in a place like this. Not in front of people like them. When he finally reached the front, Brooks handed him a sealed envelope. Marcus looked down at it. His name was written on the front in careful handwriting. The room was so quiet now that the faint rustle of the paper sounded loud. Brooks leaned closer and spoke softly. She wanted you to read it. Marcus swallowed. Behind him, hundreds of eyes waited. Among them was Richard Whitmore, whose expression had turned cold and sharp, as if he were looking at a stranger who had just stepped into something that didn't belong to him. Marcus slowly opened the envelope. The paper inside trembled slightly in his hands. He cleared his throat and began to read. No one in that church was prepared for what would happen next. Because the moment Marcus Reed spoke the first line of Margaret Whitmore's final letter, the entire room would fall completely silent. But the story of how a homeless young man ended up standing at a billionaire's funeral had begun months earlier, under a flickering bus stop light on the south side of Chicago. Winter had arrived early that year. The wind cut through the narrow streets between aging brick apartment buildings, rattling loose metal signs and pushing empty paper cups along the sidewalks. The neon lights of convenience stores buzzed softly through the night, casting pale colors across the wet pavement. At the corner of 63rd Street and Halsted stood an old bus stop shelter. The glass walls were scratched and cloudy, the metal bench cold enough to sting through clothing. But for Marcus Reed, it was better than sleeping out in the open. Marcus sat there most nights with his back against the wall and his coat wrapped tight around his chest. The coat had once belonged to a man named Earl, another homeless neighbor who had left Chicago the previous spring after finally finding a job in Indiana. Earl had pressed the coat into Marcus's hands before boarding the bus. "Keep it," he'd said. "Chicago winters don't care how tough you think you are." Earl had been right. The wind slipped easily through the cracks of the bus shelter, brushing against Marcus's face as he tried to rest. But Marcus rarely slept deeply. Instead, he watched the city. Late buses rolled past, their headlights sweeping across the sidewalk like slow-moving spotlights. Occasionally someone stepped off, workers finishing night shifts, students heading home, or travelers too tired to notice the quiet young man sitting on the bench. Most people never looked twice. Some did. Every now and then someone walking past would pause and glance at Marcus's worn shoes or the small backpack resting beside him. Sometimes they would whisper. Sometimes they would shake their heads. Marcus had learned long ago not to react. He kept his eyes gentle and his voice calm, because the truth was simple. He wasn't dangerous. He was just poor. During the day, Marcus moved through the city quietly. He collected aluminum cans along the sidewalks and alleyways, carrying them in a large plastic bag that rattled softly as he walked. When the bag filled up, he brought it to a recycling center 3 blocks away. On a good day, it might earn him $8. 10 if he was lucky. In the afternoons, he sometimes helped out at a small burger shop called Red Lantern Grill. The owner, Mr. Alvarez, was a heavy-set man with tired eyes but a generous heart. He had noticed Marcus one evening sweeping trash near the back alley and had asked if he wanted to earn a few dollars washing dishes. Marcus never complained about the work: grease-covered plates, steaming water, endless trays of metal baskets. At the end of each shift, Mr. Alvarez would slide a paper bag across the counter. Inside was always the same thing: a burger, fries, and sometimes a soda. Marcus would thank him like it was the best meal in the world, because sometimes it was. But the most important place in Marcus's routine wasn't the burger shop. It was Grace Kitchen. Grace Kitchen sat inside the basement of a small brick church not far from the bus stop. Every evening, volunteers opened the doors to anyone who needed a warm meal. The line outside usually stretched halfway down the block. Men wrapped in blankets, women holding plastic bags filled with everything they owned, young people who looked far too young to be standing there. Marcus didn't just come to eat. He came to help. Every night around 6 o'clock, he tied on a simple apron and stood beside the volunteers behind the serving table. 2 scoops of soup, one volunteer would call. Marcus would fill the bowls carefully, making sure no one received less than anyone else. Bread next, another volunteer would say. Marcus would hand each person a slice with a small smile. Some people recognized him. "Evening, Marcus," an older man with gray stubble would say. "Evening, Mr. Jenkins," Marcus would reply. "You eating tonight too?" Marcus usually nodded, but sometimes he quietly slipped his own bread onto another tray. There were always people hungrier than him. One evening, as the line began to shorten, a young volunteer named Sarah noticed something. Marcus had been working the entire time, but when she looked at his tray, it was empty. "You didn't take anything," she said. Marcus shrugged lightly. "I'll eat later." Sarah frowned gently. "You worked longer than anyone tonight." Marcus gave a small smile. "There are kids out there," he said quietly. "They need it more." Sarah looked at him for a moment, unsure what to say. Marcus simply wiped down the serving table and stacked the empty trays. For him, kindness wasn't something he thought about. It was just something he did. That night, the wind outside had grown stronger. Rain began tapping against the small basement windows as the volunteers started cleaning up. Marcus finished stacking chairs and stepped toward the exit. He pulled his coat tighter and pushed open the door to the street. Cold air rushed in immediately. The line outside had disappeared. The sidewalk was nearly empty, except for one person. A woman stood near the end of the steps beneath a street lamp. She wore a long gray coat and held her hands close to her chest to stay warm. Her hair was silver, though strands of rain had darkened it slightly. Marcus paused. He hadn't seen her in the line earlier. For a moment he wondered if she was waiting for someone. Then he noticed something else. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from a long day at work, but the kind that came from being alone too long. Marcus stepped back inside the basement. A minute later he returned holding a small bowl of soup and a piece of bread wrapped in napkins. He walked over slowly. "Ma'am," he said gently. The woman looked up. Marcus offered the bowl with both hands. "You should eat something," he said. The woman hesitated. Her eyes studied his face as if searching for something. Then she accepted the bowl. "Thank you," she said softly. Marcus nodded. "Stay near the door," he added. "It's warmer there." He turned to head back toward the bus stop. Behind him, the woman watched quietly. The rain fell harder against the streetlights. And for the first time that evening, Margaret Whitmore, the billionaire whose name filled headlines across America, stood unnoticed on a quiet Chicago sidewalk, holding a bowl of soup that had been given to her by a homeless young man who had no idea who she was. She stood there for a long moment. The warmth of the bowl spread slowly into her hands as steam curled into the cold air. Cars passed at the far end of the street, their headlights sliding across the wet pavement like quiet rivers of light. Margaret Whitmore had spent most of her life surrounded by noise, boardrooms filled with voices competing for power, flashing cameras, television interviews, endless conversations about money, technology, and growth. But standing there beneath that flickering street lamp, the world felt strangely quiet. She looked down at the soup, then she took a small sip. It was simple. Chicken broth, vegetables, a little salt. Nothing remarkable. Yet somehow, it felt warmer than the elegant dinners she had eaten at the finest restaurants in Chicago. Across the street, Marcus Reed was already walking away, his coat pulled tight against the wind. He never looked back. Margaret watched him disappear toward the bus stop at the corner. That was the first night she saw him, and for reasons she could not quite explain, she came back the following week. Grace's kitchen looked the same as before. Brick walls, narrow basement stairs, and a small hand-painted sign taped beside the door. Inside, volunteers moved around folding tables and large metal pots. The room smelled of soup, bread, and coffee. Margaret stood quietly near the end of the line, her coat buttoned high, her silver hair tucked under a dark scarf. No one recognized her. For the first time in decades, she was just another woman waiting for a meal. At the serving table, Marcus was tying an apron around his waist. He didn't notice her at first. He was focused on the line, filling bowls and sliding trays forward with steady hands. "Evening, Marcus," said Mr. Jenkins, the older man with gray stubble. "Good evening," Marcus replied with a warm smile. "Cold out there tonight." "Yeah," Marcus said softly. "Winter's coming early this year." Margaret watched him closely. He greeted every person the same way, calm, patient, respectful. Some people in the line were restless. Others looked embarrassed to be there. A few barely spoke at all. Marcus treated each of them like they mattered. When Margaret reached the front of the line, Marcus looked up. For a brief second, recognition passed through his eyes. "You came back," he said. Margaret gave a small nod. "The soup was good." Marcus smiled and filled her bowl. "Tonight it's vegetable stew," he said. "A little thicker than last week." He handed her a piece of bread. Then he glanced toward the corner of the room. "The seat by the heater's open," he said. "It's warmer there." Margaret walked slowly to the small table near the old radiator. As she sat down, she continued watching Marcus from across the room. He moved quickly, but never rushed. At one point, a young boy entered the kitchen, holding his little sister's hand. The girl looked no older than 6. Marcus crouched down so he could speak at their level. "Hey there," he said gently. "You two hungry?" The boy nodded. Marcus filled 2 bowls and added extra bread without anyone asking. "Eat slow," he told them with a grin. "The soup's hot." The little girl smiled for the first time since entering the room. Margaret felt something shift quietly inside her chest. For years, she had been surrounded by people who admired her money. But here was a young man who had almost nothing, and yet he gave more than anyone she knew. After the dinner line ended, Marcus began wiping down the tables. Margaret stood and walked toward him. "You work here?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Then why do you help every night?" Marcus leaned against the table and shrugged. "Someone helped me once," he said. "Who?" "An old teacher," Marcus replied. "Back when things were different." Margaret studied his face. "And now you're paying it forward?" Marcus gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Something like that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret asked a question that surprised even herself. If you had money, she said slowly, what would you do with it? Marcus didn't hesitate. I'd build a place for kids who don't have anywhere to sleep. Margaret blinked slightly. Why kids? Marcus looked toward the door. Outside, the wind rattled the street sign. Because sleeping outside is a lot harder when you're small, he said quietly. Margaret felt the weight of his words settle into the room. She had built companies worth billions of dollars, yet she had never heard an answer like that. That night, when Marcus stepped outside after cleaning the kitchen, he noticed the gray-coated woman standing near the sidewalk again. You headed home? He asked. Margaret nodded faintly, in a manner of speaking. Marcus gestured toward the bus stop down the street. That shelter blocks some of the wind, he said. You're welcome to sit there until the rain slows down. Margaret smiled. You're very kind. Marcus shrugged slightly. My grandma used to say kindness costs nothing, he said. Do you believe that? Marcus thought for a moment. No, he said. It costs time. Margaret watched him walk away again. But this time she didn't feel like a stranger watching from the outside. She felt like she had just discovered something rare, something honest. And over the following weeks, Margaret Whitmore would return to Grace Kitchen again and again, always quietly, always unnoticed, except by Marcus. What neither of them realized was that someone else had begun watching too, someone who did not see kindness, someone who saw a threat. But Marcus Reed had no idea anyone was watching him. For him, life moved in small routines that repeated day after day. Morning arrived quietly on the south side of Chicago. The cold air carried the distant rumble of trains and the low hum of traffic from the highway. Marcus usually woke before sunrise, sitting up on the metal bench beneath the bus shelter as the pale gray sky slowly brightened. The city looked different in those early hours. Cleaner, calmer. For a short while, it almost felt peaceful. Marcus rubbed his hands together for warmth and pulled his backpack closer. Inside were a few books from the public library, a spare pair of socks, and a small notebook he carried everywhere. He stretched his shoulders and stood. Another day. He began walking toward a nearby alley where recycling bins sat behind a grocery store. Aluminum cans rattled softly inside his bag as he collected them one by one. Some mornings people stared. Some mornings people ignored him. Either way, Marcus kept moving. Around noon he reached Red Lantern Grill, the small burger shop with the flickering red sign above the door. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with lunchtime orders. Marcus, Mr. Alvarez called from behind the counter. You're early today. Marcus smiled. Figured I'd get ahead of the dishes. Mr. Alvarez chuckled and tossed him an apron. You're the only guy I know who volunteers to wash plates. Marcus stepped into the steamy back room where metal trays stacked high beside the sink. Hot water rushed from the faucet as he began scrubbing grease from the lunch crowd's plates. The work was repetitive, but Marcus never seemed to mind. By late afternoon, his hands were wrinkled from soap and heat, yet he continued working steadily. When the shift ended, Mr. Alvarez handed him the usual paper bag. Double burger today, the man said with a wink. You earned it. Marcus nodded gratefully. Thanks, Mr. Alvarez. Outside, the sun was already sliding toward the horizon. The streets grew busier as people hurried home from offices and shops. Cars rolled past in steady lines, their headlights reflecting off the glass windows of tall buildings downtown. Marcus walked a different direction, back toward the neighborhood where the sidewalks cracked and streetlights buzzed softly above empty lots. On the corner of 64th Street, he noticed a boy struggling with a bicycle chain. The kid looked about 10 years old. The chain had slipped off completely, leaving the pedals spinning uselessly. Marcus stepped closer. Need a hand? The boy looked up cautiously. You know how to fix it? Marcus crouched beside the bike. Used to have one just like this. With careful fingers, he lifted the chain back onto the gear and rotated the pedals slowly until it settled into place. "There you go," Marcus said, standing up. The boy's face lit up. "Thanks!" He jumped onto the seat and rode away down the sidewalk. Marcus watched him go with a quiet smile. Moments like that were small, but they mattered. Later that evening, Grace Kitchen opened its doors again. Inside, the familiar rhythm returned. Volunteers filling trays, soup simmering in large pots, people lining up quietly for dinner. Marcus tied on his apron and stepped behind the serving table. Across the room, Margaret Whitmore entered quietly. She wore the same gray coat and scarf, blending easily into the crowd. Marcus noticed her almost immediately. "You made it back," he said with a friendly nod. Margaret smiled slightly. "I thought I might." Marcus filled her bowl with stew. "Cold out tonight," he said. Margaret took the bowl. "You always remember the weather," she replied. Marcus chuckled softly. "When you sleep outside, you learn to pay attention." Margaret studied him carefully. There was no bitterness in his voice, no resentment, just honesty. As the evening continued, she watched Marcus move through the room the way she had many times before. A man with shaking hands dropped his tray. Marcus knelt down immediately to help him gather the spilled food. A young mother arrived late with 2 tired children. Marcus quietly slipped extra bread onto their plates. A volunteer struggled to lift a heavy pot. Marcus carried it without being asked. Every action seemed natural, effortless. Margaret felt something deep inside her chest tighten with emotion. She had spent decades building companies, managing thousands of employees, and negotiating billion-dollar deals. But kindness like this, it was something she rarely saw. After dinner ended, Marcus stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night air was crisp, and the city lights shimmered faintly in the distance. Margaret followed him up the basement steps. For a moment, they stood side by side on the sidewalk. "Marcus," she said gently. He turned toward her. "Yes, ma'am?" Margaret hesitated. Then she asked quietly, "Do you ever wish life had turned out differently?" Marcus looked up at the cloudy sky. "I used to," he admitted. "What changed?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "I realized wishing doesn't change much." "So what does?" He thought for a moment. "Helping people," he said. Margaret tilted her head. "Even when you have so little?" Marcus smiled softly. "Especially then." Margaret felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. Few people had ever answered her questions so simply. She looked down the street where traffic lights blinked red and green in the distance. Then she asked one more question. "Marcus, if someone offered you a real chance one day, something big, what would you do with it?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'd build a place for kids who sleep outside." Margaret nodded slowly. The answer confirmed something she had been thinking about for weeks. But neither of them noticed the dark SUV parked half a block away. Inside the vehicle, a man sat behind tinted windows, watching the 2 figures standing under the streetlight. Richard Whitmore lowered his phone slowly. He had been following his mother for days. At first he thought it was a misunderstanding, a brief curiosity. But now he saw the truth in front of him. His mother, the billionaire whose name built one of the largest tech companies in the country, was speaking quietly with a homeless young man on a street corner. Richard's jaw tightened. From his perspective, there was only one explanation. This boy was manipulating her, and Richard Whitmore had no intention of letting that happen. From inside the dark SUV, Richard Whitmore watched the 2 figures standing beneath the streetlight. Rainwater glistened on the pavement. The glow from the street lamp painted long shadows across the sidewalk. His mother stood there calmly, speaking to the young man as if they had known each other for years. Richard's jaw tightened. For decades, he had watched people circle around Margaret Whitmore like moths around a flame. Investors, politicians, charity organizers, everyone wanted something from her. He had spent half his life protecting her from opportunists. And now this. A homeless young man in a worn coat, standing beside one of the richest women in America. To Richard, the situation was obvious. He picked up his phone and snapped a quick photo through the windshield. Marcus Reed had no idea. Marcus was simply talking. "Supposed to get colder this weekend," Marcus said, glancing toward the dark sky. Margaret nodded. "Chicago always warns you before winter," she replied. Marcus smiled slightly. "Not always." Margaret studied his face again, the same way she had done for weeks now. There was a calmness in him she rarely saw in the world she lived in. No ambition for status, no hunger for attention, just quiet determination. She had spent her life meeting brilliant people, engineers, entrepreneurs, leaders of massive corporations. But kindness like this, it was rare. Marcus rubbed his hands together against the cold. "You should probably head home," he said gently. "Storm's getting worse." Margaret almost laughed at the irony. Home. Her house was a 20-room mansion overlooking Lake Michigan. But at that moment, she simply nodded. "I suppose I should." Marcus stepped back. "Good night, ma'am." Margaret hesitated before turning to leave. For a moment, she looked as though she might say something more. Then she simply walked toward the waiting black car parked farther down the street. Marcus didn't notice the SUV where Richard sat. He turned toward the bus stop instead, his footsteps echoing lightly against the wet pavement. Inside the SUV, Richard lowered the phone slowly. His expression had hardened. The following afternoon, he drove directly to the Whitmore estate. The mansion stood on a quiet, tree-lined street overlooking the lake. Tall iron gates guarded the entrance, and security cameras watched every angle of the property. Richard walked through the front doors with quick steps. His mother sat in the sunroom near the tall windows, reading a book. Margaret Whitmore looked peaceful there. The late afternoon sunlight painted the room in warm gold. Richard held up the phone. "We need to talk." Margaret looked up calmly. "About what?" Richard showed her the photo. The picture clearly displayed Marcus standing beside her outside Grace's kitchen. Margaret studied the image for a moment. Then she placed the book down gently. "You followed me," she said. Richard's voice sharpened. "I protected you." "There's a difference." Richard stepped closer. "That boy," he said, tapping the screen. "He's homeless. He's been spending time with you for weeks. Don't you see what he's doing?" Margaret remained silent. Richard continued. "These people are professionals. They look for someone wealthy, someone older, someone generous." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You believe he's pretending to be poor?" Richard hesitated. "No," he said quickly. "But he knows exactly who you are." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. "No," she said calmly. "He doesn't." Richard frowned. "You expect me to believe that?" Margaret's voice remained steady. "I've never told him my name." Richard laughed under his breath. "Come on, Mom. You're one of the most recognizable women in this city." Margaret looked out toward the lake. "You'd be surprised how invisible you become when you remove the title." Richard shook his head. "This is dangerous." Margaret turned her attention back to him. "What exactly do you think he wants from me?" Richard answered immediately. "Money." Margaret studied her son's face carefully. "And if he doesn't?" Richard crossed his arms. "That's not how the world works." Margaret said nothing more. But deep down she already knew something Richard did not. Marcus Reed had never asked her for anything, not once. That evening, Richard made a decision. The next day, he visited Grace's kitchen. The volunteers were busy preparing trays of soup when the large black SUV stopped outside the church basement. Richard stepped out wearing a tailored coat and polished shoes. Inside, the room quieted slightly as he entered. Marcus was stacking chairs near the back wall. Richard walked straight toward him. "You Marcus Reed?" Marcus looked up, surprised. "Yes, sir." Richard's voice was cool. "I'm Richard Whitmore." Marcus blinked once. The name meant nothing to him. Richard noticed the confusion and continued. "My mother is Margaret Whitmore." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "Oh." For a moment, Marcus simply processed the information. Then he nodded politely. "She's very kind." Richard didn't smile. "I'm here to give you a message." Marcus waited. Richard's tone sharpened. "Stay away from her." The words landed heavily in the quiet room. Marcus looked puzzled. "I'm sorry." "You heard me," Richard said firmly. "My mother doesn't need strangers taking advantage of her generosity." Marcus's shoulders stiffened slightly. "I'm not taking advantage of anyone." Richard leaned closer. "Then consider this a warning." Marcus held his ground, though his voice remained calm. "I didn't even know who she was." Richard studied him carefully. For a brief moment he wondered if the boy might actually be telling the truth, but suspicion had already taken hold. "Don't come near her again," Richard said. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. Marcus stood there silently. Around him, the volunteers slowly returned to their work. But something inside Marcus had shifted. For the first time since meeting the quiet woman in the soup line, he wondered if kindness had just created a problem he never meant to cause. And somewhere across the city, Margaret Whitmore was about to realize that Marcus Reed had suddenly disappeared from the only place she could find him. The next evening, Grace's kitchen opened its basement doors just as it always did. The smell of soup filled the room. Volunteers moved between folding tables, stacking trays and pouring coffee into paper cups. Outside, the wind pushed cold air through the narrow street. Margaret Whitmore stepped quietly down the stairs. She wore the same gray coat she had worn many nights before, blending into the line of people waiting for dinner. But something felt different. She noticed it almost immediately. Marcus was not behind the serving table. At first, she assumed he was running late. Perhaps he was finishing work at the burger shop. Perhaps he would appear in a few minutes with that calm smile and quiet greeting. But 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Marcus never appeared. Margaret waited near the end of the room, her eyes scanning the volunteers. Finally, she approached Sarah, the young woman helping serve bread. "Excuse me," Margaret said gently. Sarah looked up. "Yes?" Margaret hesitated slightly before asking. "The young man who helps here. Marcus?" Sarah's expression shifted. "Oh." Margaret felt a small knot form in her chest. "Is he all right?" Sarah wiped her hands on a towel. "He didn't come tonight," she said quietly. "Did something happen?" Sarah lowered her voice. "A man came here yesterday looking for him." Margaret's heart skipped. "What man?" "Tall, expensive suit, black SUV parked outside." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Richard," Sarah continued. "He told Marcus to stay away from someone." Margaret's hands tightened slightly around the tray she was holding. "And Marcus?" Sarah sighed. "He finished helping us clean up. Then he said maybe it was better if he didn't come back for a while." The room seemed suddenly quieter. Margaret nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said softly. She turned and walked back up the basement stairs. Outside, the night had turned colder. Rain began falling again, light at first, then heavier. Margaret stood beneath the streetlight for a moment, looking down the empty sidewalk. She knew exactly where Marcus might be. The bus stop. Her car waited at the corner, but she didn't use it. Instead, she walked. The rain tapped against her coat as she moved through the quiet streets. Storefront windows reflected blurred lights across the pavement. A few blocks later, she reached the intersection of 63rd and Halsted. The old bus shelter stood exactly where she remembered. Inside, Marcus sat on the metal bench with his backpack beside him. The yellow light above the shelter flickered softly. Marcus looked up when he heard footsteps. For a moment, he seemed surprised. Then he stood. "You shouldn't be walking around in weather like this," he said gently. Margaret stepped under the shelter, brushing rain from her coat. "I could say the same thing about you." Marcus gave a small smile. "This is home." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet truth. For a moment they stood together in the dim light, listening to the rain. Margaret spoke first. "My son came to see you." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm sorry about that." Marcus shook his head. "You don't need to apologize." Margaret studied his face. "You stopped coming to the kitchen." Marcus leaned back against the metal wall of the shelter. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "You weren't causing trouble." Marcus hesitated. "Your son seemed pretty sure I was." Margaret sighed softly. "Richard sees the world differently than I do." Marcus nodded. "I figured." Rainwater ran down the glass panels of the bus stop, blurring the streetlights outside. Margaret looked toward the empty road. "You could have explained things to him." Marcus shook his head again. "Would it have mattered?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said quietly, "Probably not." Marcus let out a small breath. "I don't blame him," he added. Margaret turned back to him. "You don't?" Marcus shrugged. "If I were rich and someone like me was suddenly talking to my mom, I might wonder too." Margaret studied him carefully. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just understanding. That surprised her more than anything. She folded her hands together. "Marcus," she said slowly, "do you trust people easily?" Marcus looked out at the rain. "No," he said, "but I try to trust kindness." Margaret felt something deep in her chest shift again. She stepped closer. "What if someone gave you a real chance one day?" she asked quietly. "A big one." Marcus looked at her curiously. "What kind of chance?" Margaret hesitated. "Something that could change your life." Marcus thought about that for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. "I'd probably mess it up." Margaret laughed softly. "I doubt that." Marcus grew serious again. "But if it did happen," he said, "I'd do the same thing I told you before." Margaret waited. "I'd build a place for kids who sleep outside," Marcus said. The rain softened slightly. Margaret nodded slowly. "You remember saying that?" Marcus glanced at her. "You remember everything." Margaret smiled faintly. Old habit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Cars passed occasionally through the intersection, sending waves of water across the street. Finally, Marcus picked up his backpack. "I should probably head back before the rain gets worse." Margaret watched him. "Marcus." He turned. "If an opportunity comes your way someday," she said quietly, "don't run from it." Marcus gave a small, uncertain nod. "I'll try." Margaret stepped out of the bus shelter. The rain continued falling as she walked toward the waiting car at the corner. Marcus remained under the flickering light, watching her disappear down the street. Neither of them knew it would be the last time they ever spoke, because exactly 1 month later, news of Margaret Whitmore's death would spread across every television screen in America. And Marcus Reed would soon find himself standing inside a grand Chicago church, surrounded by billionaires and strangers, about to read words that would change his life forever. The news broke on a gray Monday morning. Television anchors spoke in measured voices as photos of Margaret Whitmore filled the screen. News headlines rolled across the bottom of televisions in cafes, airports, and office lobbies across the country. Tech billionaire Margaret Whitmore passes away at 72. Founder of Whitmore Technologies remembered as visionary leader. Nation mourns loss of one of America's most influential entrepreneurs. Marcus Reed heard the news from the small television mounted above the counter at Red Lantern Grill. He stood behind the sink, washing plates as he always did. The cook turned up the volume. Whitmore passed peacefully at her home late Sunday evening, the reporter said. Marcus froze. Water continued running over the dishes in his hands. He stared at the television screen. There she was, the quiet woman from the soup line, the woman who had stood beneath the bus shelter in the rain. Margaret Whitmore. Marcus slowly placed the plate down. Mr. Alvarez noticed his expression. "You all right, kid?" Marcus nodded faintly, though he didn't trust his voice. "Yeah," he said quietly, but he wasn't. That evening, the city seemed heavier than usual. Marcus walked slowly toward the bus stop, the cold wind pressing against his coat. He sat beneath the flickering light and stared at the pavement. For weeks, he had assumed Margaret simply stopped visiting the kitchen. Now he knew why. She had never come back. 2 days later, Marcus found a sealed envelope inside his backpack. He hadn't noticed it before. The paper was thick and carefully folded. His name was written on the front. Marcus Reed. Inside was a short message. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore requested your presence at her memorial service. Street, Andrew Church. Friday at 10 a.m. Please see me upon arrival. Daniel Brooks, attorney for the Whitmore estate." Marcus read the letter 3 times. He didn't understand. Why would someone like Margaret Whitmore ask for him? For a moment, he considered ignoring the invitation, but something about it felt important. So on Friday morning, Marcus borrowed a suit jacket from Mr. Alvarez. It didn't quite fit. The sleeves were slightly too long, and the shoulders hung loosely. But it was the nicest clothing Marcus had worn in years. The train ride downtown felt unreal. Chicago's skyline rose into the cloudy sky as Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk near St. Andrew Church. The building was enormous. Stone walls stretched high above the street, and tall stained glass windows reflected the pale morning light. Luxury cars lined the curb. Drivers stood beside open doors while guests stepped out wearing dark suits and expensive coats. Marcus hesitated near the entrance. For a moment he wondered if he had made a mistake, but the letter was still in his pocket. So he walked inside. The church was already full. Rows of polished pews stretched across the room, filled with people Marcus had only seen on television. Executives, politicians, investors, people who ran companies worth more than entire neighborhoods. Marcus quietly took a seat near the back. The whispers began almost immediately. "Who is that? Does he belong here? Is he with the staff?" Marcus kept his eyes down. He had lived long enough to recognize those looks. At the front of the church, Margaret Whitmore's photograph stood beside a white casket surrounded by flowers. She looked the same as always, calm, kind, almost as if she might step forward and start asking questions again. Marcus felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He had known her only a short time, but she had listened to him in a way few people ever had. A quiet hush moved through the room as a tall man stepped toward the podium. Daniel Brooks, Margaret's longtime attorney. Brooks adjusted his glasses and spoke into the microphone. Margaret Whitmore believed deeply in the power of innovation, he began. His voice echoed gently through the church. She built companies, supported education, and gave millions to causes she believed would improve the world. Guests nodded respectfully, but the atmosphere shifted when Brooks closed his folder. "There is one final request Mrs. Whitmore made before her passing," he said. The room grew still. Richard Whitmore sat in the front row, his posture straight and expression guarded. Brooks continued. "She asked that a specific individual be present today." He looked toward the back of the church. Marcus felt a sudden chill. Brooks spoke clearly. "Marcus Reed." The name traveled across the room like a ripple in water. Heads turned. Dozens of eyes searched the pews. Marcus slowly stood. He could feel every person watching him as he walked down the long center aisle. Whispers followed him. "Who is he? Why him?" Richard Whitmore's gaze locked onto Marcus immediately. Cold. Suspicious. Marcus reached the front and stopped beside the podium. Daniel Brooks handed him a sealed envelope. "This is for you," Brooks said quietly. Marcus looked down at it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Margaret's. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. The paper inside was carefully folded. Marcus took a breath. Behind him, the entire church waited. Hundreds of powerful people. Executives worth billions. Members of Margaret Whitmore's own family. All watching the homeless young man standing beside the podium. Marcus unfolded the letter slowly. The paper rustled softly in the silent room. He lifted his eyes toward the audience. Then he began to read. No one in that church realized they were about to hear words that would shake the entire Whitmore family. Because Margaret Whitmore's final message had been written for one person in that room. And it was not her son. Marcus Reed stood at the podium with the folded letter trembling slightly in his hands. The church had fallen into a silence so deep that even the faint rustling of paper sounded loud. Hundreds of eyes watched him. Executives leaned forward. Family members exchanged uneasy glances. And in the front row, Richard Whitmore sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Marcus like a blade. Marcus swallowed slowly. Then he began to read. "My name is Margaret Whitmore." His voice echoed softly through the vaulted ceiling. "I imagine that by the time this letter is read, many of the people sitting in this room will already be thinking about the legacy I leave behind." A few quiet murmurs passed through the pews. Marcus continued. "For most of my life, people measured success by numbers, stock prices, company valuations, and the size of a fortune." Marcus paused briefly. "But in the final years of my life, I began measuring something else." He lifted his eyes for a moment. Many of the guests were listening now with careful attention. Some leaned forward. Others simply waited. Marcus looked back down at the letter. "I began measuring kindness." The words hung in the air. Richard Whitmore shifted slightly in his seat. Marcus continued reading. "For decades, I believed I understood the world. I believed intelligence, ambition, and power were the forces that built great things." Marcus's voice softened. "But the truth is, I learned more about humanity in one Chicago soup kitchen than I did in 20 years of boardrooms." A ripple of confusion spread across the church. Marcus turned the page. "There is a young man in this room today who showed me something I had almost forgotten." Marcus hesitated. His chest tightened as he realized where the letter was going. He forced himself to continue. "His name is Marcus Reed." The reaction was immediate. Whispers erupted across the room. Several guests turned sharply toward Marcus. Richard Whitmore stood halfway from his seat before catching himself. Marcus's voice wavered slightly, but he continued reading. "When I first met Marcus, he believed I was simply another woman in line for soup." A few people in the audience frowned in confusion. He had no idea who I was, Marcus read. He did not know my company. He did not know a fortune. And he certainly did not know that every newspaper in this country had written about my life. Marcus lifted his eyes again. The entire room was watching him now. But Marcus Reed treated me with more kindness than many people who have known me for decades. A quiet stillness spread across the church. Marcus read the next line slowly. He offered me a warm meal when he himself was hungry. Another pause. He gave his bread to children when no one was watching. Marcus's voice grew steadier. And when I asked him what he would do if he ever had wealth, he did not say he would buy a house or a car. Marcus swallowed. He said he would build a place where children who sleep outside could feel safe. The silence in the church deepened. Marcus turned to the final page of the letter. This letter is my final decision. The words felt heavy in the air. Marcus continued. My family has inherited comfort for generations. They have known opportunity their entire lives. Richard Whitmore stood slowly, but Marcus kept reading. Marcus Reed has known something else. Marcus's voice trembled slightly. He has known hardship. Another line followed, and yet he still chose kindness. Marcus reached the final paragraph. Therefore, it is my wish that the majority of my estate be placed into the hands of Marcus Reed. The sentence landed like thunder. Gasps erupted across the room. Several people stood abruptly. Someone whispered, "That's impossible." Marcus stared down at the page, his mind struggling to process the words he had just read. But the letter continued. The funds will be used to create shelters, education programs, and safe housing for homeless children across the city of Chicago. Marcus's voice softened. Marcus once told me that kindness costs time. He read the final sentence slowly. I now give him the resources to give that time to the world. Marcus lowered the paper. For several seconds, no one spoke. The entire church had frozen. Then Richard Whitmore stood up fully. His voice cut through the silence. This is ridiculous. Dozens of heads turned toward him. That boy manipulated her, Richard said sharply. Marcus felt the entire room shift. The moment of quiet had shattered. Richard stepped into the aisle. My mother was ill, vulnerable. He pointed directly at Marcus. And this is the result. The accusations spread through the audience like sparks. Marcus felt the weight of hundreds of suspicious eyes, but Daniel Brooks stepped forward calmly. Mr. Whitmore, he said, his voice firm. Richard turned toward him. This will be contested, Richard snapped. Brooks nodded slightly. I expected that. He turned toward the audience and opened a laptop sitting on the podium. There is one final piece of evidence Mrs. Whitmore asked us to show today. The screen behind the podium flickered to life. A video began playing. Margaret Whitmore appeared on the screen, sitting calmly in a quiet room. Her silver hair rested neatly on her shoulders. She looked directly into the camera. If you are watching this, she said gently, it means my son believes Marcus Reed somehow manipulated me. A ripple of surprise moved through the church. Margaret smiled faintly. I want everyone here to understand something clearly. She leaned forward slightly. Marcus Reed never knew who I was. The room fell silent again, and for the first time since the reading began, the whispers in the church began to change. The large screen behind the podium glowed softly in the dim light of St. Andrew Church. Margaret Whitmore's image filled the space above the altar, her calm face looking directly into the camera. The room fell completely still again. Even Richard Whitmore stopped speaking. Margaret's recorded voice continued, steady and clear. I know many of you will be confused by my decision, she said gently. Some of you may even be angry. A few guests shifted in their seats. Margaret smiled faintly. That's all right. I expected it. She folded her hands in her lap. My son believes Marcus Reed somehow manipulated me. A ripple moved across the pews as people glanced again toward Marcus. Margaret shook her head slowly on the screen. But the truth is much simpler. She leaned slightly closer to the camera. Marcus Reed never asked me for anything. The statement hung in the air like a quiet echo. Marcus stood frozen near the podium, his heart beating heavily in his chest. Margaret continued. He never asked my name. Another pause. He never asked about my company. Several business executives exchanged uncertain looks. And he certainly never asked about my money. The silence deepened. Margaret's expression softened. When I first met Marcus, he believed I was another woman waiting for soup. A few quiet murmurs spread through the room. But that is exactly why I trusted him. Margaret turned her head slightly, as if remembering something. I watched him for weeks, she said. I watched him give away his own meals. I watched him repair a child's bicycle outside the kitchen. I watched him help strangers who had nothing to offer him in return. Marcus lowered his eyes. He hadn't realized she had seen all of those moments. Margaret's voice grew warmer. In a world where people constantly compete for more, Marcus Reed chose to give. The guests in the church began listening differently now. The earlier suspicion was fading. Margaret continued. My son believes people only act out of self-interest. She paused. But Marcus Reed reminded me that kindness still exists. Richard Whitmore's jaw tightened as the video continued playing. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. I spent my life building companies that changed the world, she said. But Marcus Reed reminded me that changing a single life can matter just as much. The camera zoomed slightly closer. If you are watching this video, it means Marcus is standing in that church right now. Marcus felt hundreds of eyes turn toward him again. Margaret smiled on the screen. Marcus, if you're hearing this, I want you to know something. Marcus slowly lifted his head. You showed me something I had almost forgotten. The room was so quiet that even the faint buzz of the projector could be heard. You showed me that kindness doesn't need recognition. Margaret's voice softened even further. You gave your time to strangers when you had nothing yourself. She paused, and I believe the world needs more of that. Marcus felt a tightness rise in his throat. Margaret's expression turned serious. To my family and business partners sitting in that room, her eyes seemed to look directly at them. You have known privilege your entire lives. Richard Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But Marcus Reed has known struggle. Margaret spoke the next words slowly. And yet he chose compassion. The screen faded briefly as the recording continued. My decision is final. A murmur spread through the church again. The funds I leave to Marcus are not meant to reward him. Margaret leaned closer to the camera. They are meant to amplify what he is already doing. The room remained silent. Marcus once told me he dreamed of building a place where homeless children could sleep safely. Margaret smiled softly. So I am giving him the chance. The video ended with one final sentence. Because sometimes the person who deserves the greatest opportunity is the one who never asked for it. The screen went dark. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the quiet whispers began again. But they sounded different now. Some guests nodded thoughtfully. Others looked toward Marcus with curiosity rather than suspicion. Even a few of Margaret's business associates seemed moved by the video. But Richard Whitmore stepped forward again. His voice was sharper this time. This proves nothing. The room shifted uneasily. Richard pointed toward the screen. My mother was emotional. She was aging. His eyes moved toward Marcus. That boy spent weeks gaining her trust. Marcus stood silently. Richard turned toward Daniel Brooks. We will challenge this in court. Brooks remained calm. That is your right. Richard's voice rose. My mother built a company worth billions of dollars. He gestured toward Marcus. And now we are supposed to believe she left everything to a stranger she met in a soup kitchen. The tension in the room returned. Marcus felt the weight of it pressing down again. But Daniel Brooks stepped beside him. There is one more document, Brooks said quietly. He lifted a folder from the podium. This will was reviewed and finalized by 3 independent attorneys. Brooks placed the papers carefully on the podium. It has also been confirmed by 2 medical evaluations verifying Mrs. Whitmore's mental clarity. The room grew quiet once more. Brooks looked directly at Richard. The will is legally binding. Richard's face hardened. This isn't over. Brooks nodded. No, he said calmly. It isn't. Because within days, the Whitmore family would take the matter to court, and Marcus Reed, the homeless young man who had once slept beneath a Chicago bus shelter, would soon find himself standing in a courtroom filled with lawyers, reporters, and judges, where the final decision about Margaret Whitmore's legacy would be made. The courthouse stood in the center of downtown Chicago, its tall stone columns rising above the crowded street like a monument to authority. On the morning of the hearing, television vans lined the sidewalks outside. Reporters gathered near the entrance, their cameras ready, microphones in hand. The story had spread quickly. A billionaire's fortune left to a homeless man. Some people called it inspiring. Others called it suspicious. Marcus Reed stepped out of a car beside Daniel Brooks and looked up at the massive building. He had never been inside a courthouse before. The stone steps seemed endless. Brooks noticed Marcus's hesitation. Take your time, he said quietly. Marcus nodded. His borrowed suit fit a little better now, though the sleeves were still slightly too long. The coat had been pressed carefully by Mr. Alvarez the night before. Marcus took a deep breath. Then he followed Brooks inside. The courtroom was already crowded. Journalists filled the back rows. Several business reporters whispered quietly while flipping through notebooks. Cameras waited outside the door for updates. At the front sat the Whitmore family. Richard Whitmore looked composed but tense, his expression sharp behind polished glasses. Beside him sat 2 attorneys from one of the most expensive law firms in Chicago. Marcus took a seat beside Brooks at the opposite table. For a moment, the entire room seemed to study him. Some eyes were curious, others skeptical. To many people, Marcus still looked like he didn't belong there. The courtroom doors opened. All rise, the bailiff called. Judge Eleanor Harris entered and took her seat. She was a calm woman with silver hair and a reputation for fairness that had earned respect throughout the state. Everyone sat again. Judge Harris opened the case file in front of her. We are here today regarding the estate of Margaret Whitmore, she said clearly. Her eyes moved across the room. The Whitmore family has filed a challenge against the validity of Mrs. Whitmore's will. Richard's attorney stood. Your Honor, our concern is simple. He gestured slightly toward Marcus. Our client believes Mrs. Whitmore was influenced by an individual who developed a personal relationship with her shortly before her passing. The lawyer's voice was smooth and confident. This individual, Mr. Marcus Reed, was in a position to gain financially from that relationship. The room grew quiet. Marcus felt every eye turning toward him again. The attorney continued. Mrs. Whitmore was elderly and emotionally vulnerable. It is our position that her judgment may have been compromised. Judge Harris nodded calmly. Thank you. Defense? Daniel Brooks stood slowly. His voice was steady. Your Honor, Margaret Whitmore was one of the most accomplished business leaders in this country. He placed a folder on the table. She ran a billion-dollar technology company for 30 years. To suggest she could be easily manipulated is not only inaccurate, It contradicts every medical evaluation conducted before this will was signed. Brooks turned toward the judge. We have documentation confirming Mrs. Whitmore's mental clarity at the time the will was finalized. Judge Harris accepted the file and examined it briefly. Brooks continued. We also have witnesses. The courtroom stirred slightly. Judge Harris nodded. Proceed. The first witness was Sarah from Grace Kitchen. She stepped carefully to the stand, her hands folded nervously. Brooks asked a simple question. How long did you observe Marcus Reed volunteering at the kitchen? Almost a year, Sarah said. Did he ever ask for money from anyone there? No, she answered firmly. Did he treat Mrs. Whitmore differently than anyone else? Sarah shook her head. He treated her the same as everyone. Brooks nodded. Thank you. The next witness was Mr. Alvarez from Red Lantern Grill. The heavy-set restaurant owner sat straight in the chair, looking uncomfortable in a courtroom. Brooks spoke gently. How long have you known Marcus? About 2 years. And how would you describe his character? Mr. Alvarez glanced toward Marcus before answering. That kid works harder than anyone I've met. A few quiet murmurs passed through the room. He washes dishes, cleans tables, fixes things around the shop, Alvarez continued. And half the time he gives away the food I give him. Richard's lawyer stood. Mr. Alvarez, are you aware that Marcus Reed is now the primary beneficiary of a multi-billion-dollar estate? Alvarez shrugged. I heard that. And that doesn't concern you? Alvarez leaned forward slightly. What concerns me is how many people ignored that boy before today. The courtroom grew quiet again. Finally, Daniel Brooks called the final piece of evidence. He rolled a television monitor into view. This is the video Mrs. Whitmore recorded shortly before finalizing her will. The screen flickered to life. Margaret Whitmore appeared again. The same calm face, the same steady voice. I am recording this to confirm that my decisions regarding my estate are entirely my own. Judge Harris watched closely. Margaret continued. No one pressured me. No one manipulated me. Her eyes seemed to look directly through the camera. I chose Marcus Reed because he represents something this world desperately needs. She paused. Compassion. The video ended. The courtroom sat in silence for several seconds. Judge Harris closed the case file slowly. She looked toward Richard Whitmore. Your attorneys have presented concerns, she said. However, the documentation, witness testimony, and recorded statement from Mrs. Whitmore provide clear evidence of her intentions. Richard's hands tightened on the table. Judge Harris spoke the final words calmly. The will is valid. A quiet gasp moved through the courtroom. Marcus sat frozen in his chair. Judge Harris continued. Marcus Reed is legally recognized as the beneficiary designated in Margaret Whitmore's will. Reporters rushed toward the doors. The news would spread across the country within hours. But Marcus remained seated. The weight of everything was still settling in his chest. He had spent years sleeping beneath a bus shelter. And now, in a single moment, his entire future had changed. But the question everyone in the courtroom was now wondering was the same one Margaret Whitmore had once asked him beneath a streetlight. What would Marcus Reed do with it? The answer did not come immediately. In the days after the court ruling, Marcus Reed felt as if the world had suddenly grown louder. Reporters called Daniel Brooks nonstop. Television crews waited outside the courthouse steps. Newspapers across the country ran the same headline in different forms. Homeless man inherits billionaire's fortune. To many people, it sounded like a miracle. To Marcus, it felt overwhelming. He spent the first week quietly avoiding cameras. He returned to the South Side, walking the same streets he had walked for years. The same cracked sidewalks. The same old bus stop shelter where he had once slept through freezing nights. Nothing there had changed. And yet everything had. Marcus stood beneath the flickering light of the bus stop one evening, his hands resting on the metal bench. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic across the city. He remembered the conversation he had once had there. Margaret Whitmore standing beside him in the rain, her voice calm. If an opportunity comes your way someday, don't run from it. Marcus looked up at the cloudy sky. I'm not running, he said quietly to himself. He just needed to remember why. A week later, construction began on a vacant lot not far from Grace's kitchen. At first, the neighborhood didn't pay much attention. Vacant lots in that part of Chicago often stayed empty for years. But then trucks arrived. Workers began clearing debris. Survey markers appeared along the edges of the property. A large sign was placed beside the sidewalk. Coming soon, Whitmore Hope Center. A safe place for Chicago's homeless youth. People in the neighborhood stopped to read the sign. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled. Months passed. The empty lot slowly transformed. Steel beams rose into the sky. Brick walls followed. Windows were installed. A playground appeared in the courtyard behind the building. Marcus visited the site almost every day. He wore a simple jacket and walked quietly through the construction area, asking questions and listening carefully to the workers. He wasn't building a mansion. He wasn't buying luxury cars. He was building something he had once described in a simple sentence. A place where kids who slept outside could finally feel safe. By the following year, the building stood finished. It was 3 stories tall, with wide windows and warm lights shining from inside. The entrance faced the street where Marcus had once collected cans. Above the doors hung a polished sign. Whitmore Hope Center. The grand opening drew a crowd larger than anyone expected. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalk. Volunteers from Grace's kitchen stood near the entrance. Even a few reporters arrived quietly with cameras. Marcus stood near the podium in front of the building. He wore a simple suit, though it fit him much better now. Daniel Brooks stood nearby, watching proudly. Sarah from the kitchen stood beside Mr. Alvarez, who had insisted on closing the restaurant early so he could attend. Marcus stepped forward. The crowd grew quiet. He looked out across the faces in front of him. Many of them were people who had known him before the court case, before the headlines, before the fortune. He took a breath. "A year ago," Marcus began, "I was sleeping at a bus stop down the street." A few people nodded. Marcus continued. "I didn't know anything about business or investments." He smiled faintly. "I still don't know much." The crowd chuckled softly. "But I did know something important." He paused. "That nobody deserves to grow up feeling invisible." The wind moved gently through the crowd. Marcus gestured toward the building behind him. "This place is for kids who need a second chance." His voice softened. "Because someone once gave me one." The audience grew quiet again. Marcus looked toward the entrance of the building. Inside were warm beds, a cafeteria serving hot meals, classrooms where children could study after school, counselors ready to help them build better futures. He finished with a simple sentence. "I promised someone I would try to make the world a little kinder." Applause spread through the crowd. Not loud, but sincere. As people began entering the building, Marcus stepped aside. For the first time in many months, he felt something close to peace. But then he noticed someone standing near the edge of the crowd. A man in a dark coat, watching quietly. Marcus recognized him immediately. Richard Whitmore. Richard stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. The arrogance that once filled his posture seemed softer now. Marcus walked over slowly. Neither man spoke for a moment. Finally, Richard held out a small envelope. Marcus looked down at it. "What's this?" he asked. Richard's voice was quieter than Marcus remembered. "A donation." Marcus looked up. Richard gave a faint, uneasy smile. My mother would have wanted to help. Marcus accepted the envelope slowly. For the first time since the funeral, the tension between them seemed to loosen. And somewhere inside the new building behind them, children's laughter echoed down the hallway. Marcus turned toward the sound. The promise he had once made beneath a rainy bus stop had finally begun to take shape. Children's laughter echoed through the hallways of the Whitmore Hope Center. It was a sound Marcus had rarely heard growing up. The building behind him was alive now, bright lights glowing through wide windows, warm air flowing through open doors, volunteers moving through the lobby with trays of food and stacks of books. For years, this block had been empty, just broken pavement and weeds pushing through the cracks. Now it was something else entirely, a place that felt safe. Marcus stepped inside the front entrance. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and warm bread from the kitchen down the hall. Colorful drawings hung along the walls, pictures made by the first group of children who had moved into the center that week. Some of the drawings showed houses. Others showed trees. One showed a large sun rising over a small building with the words "Home" written across the roof. Marcus stopped in front of that picture. He stared at it for a long moment. A volunteer named Sarah walked over beside him. "You see that one?" she said softly. Marcus nodded. "Who drew it?" "A little boy named Jordan," Sarah said. "He arrived here 2 nights ago." Marcus smiled faintly. "Does he like it here?" Sarah looked toward the hallway where children's voices could be heard. "He asked if the lights stay on all night," she said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What did you tell him?" Sarah smiled. "I told him they do." Marcus felt something warm settle quietly in his chest. Down the hall, a group of kids ran past carrying basketballs toward the small indoor gym. One of them slowed when he saw Marcus standing near the doorway. "Hey," the boy said. "You the guy who built this place?" Marcus laughed softly. "I guess you could say that." The boy grinned. "Cool." Then he ran off again. Marcus leaned against the wall and watched them disappear down the hallway. For a moment he thought back to the nights he had spent beneath the bus shelter. The cold wind, the flickering yellow light, the quiet feeling of being invisible in a city full of millions. That life felt very far away now, but he had never forgotten it. Later that evening, the crowd from the opening ceremony slowly faded. Neighbors returned home. Volunteers cleaned the kitchen. The children settled into their new rooms. Marcus stepped outside for some fresh air. The sun had already dipped below the skyline, leaving the sky painted with deep shades of orange and purple. Across the street, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Marcus sat down on the steps near the entrance. For the first time that day, everything was quiet. Footsteps approached from the sidewalk. Marcus looked up. Richard Whitmore stood there again. But this time he wasn't dressed in a suit, just a simple coat and dark jeans. He looked around at the building thoughtfully. "I have to admit," Richard said slowly, "I didn't think you'd actually do it." Marcus smiled slightly. "Do what?" Richard gestured toward the center. "All this." Marcus shrugged. "It was her idea first." Richard nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. For a moment, neither man spoke. The city lights began to flicker on one by one along the street. Richard reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this in my mother's office," he said. Marcus took it carefully. The paper was old but neatly folded. Marcus opened it. Inside was a short handwritten note. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Margaret Whitmore. "Marcus, if you are reading this, it means the center is already open. I wish I could see it, but I know something important. You will build something far greater than any company I ever created, because kindness multiplies. And when you give people hope, they pass it forward. Thank you for reminding me of that. Margaret Marcus folded the paper slowly. For a moment, neither he nor Richard spoke. Finally, Richard said quietly, "She believed in you." Marcus looked toward the building where the warm lights glowed through the windows. "I think she believed in people," Marcus replied. Richard nodded slowly. For years he had measured success in profits and market value. Now he was beginning to see something different. Inside the Whitmore Hope Center, children's laughter echoed again. Marcus stood and looked toward the entrance. Above the doors hung the polished bronze sign, Margaret Whitmore Foundation. The letters reflected the soft glow of the streetlights. Marcus smiled. Because somewhere in that building, children who once slept on cold sidewalks were now falling asleep in warm beds. And the kindness that had started with a simple bowl of soup in a Chicago kitchen had grown into something much larger. Sometimes a single moment of kindness seems small, but sometimes it can change an entire life. And sometimes it can change many. If this story touched your heart, I want to ask you something simple. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe kindness still exists in this world, and if you believe one small act can change someone's future. Comment hope. I read the comments every day, and I truly want to know what you think. Your words might inspire the next person watching this story. And if you enjoy powerful stories about kindness, justice, and the unexpected moments that change people's lives, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story you see here might move you even more. And who knows, the next story might remind someone out there that they are not invisible.